All right. Thanks for coming back. There's another episode of ICU Doc Talk. I think today I wanted to talk about how to teach, like in a clinical setting. Now, my experience, talking about this, it's going to be teaching like this will come from my perspective, which is, I was a undergrad student in chemistry, and then I was a medical student, and then I was a resident, and then I was a fellow, and now I'm an attending. So I've gone through these various stages of being, in training, and now I'm no longer in training, and I now, practice independently. So this today it's going to be from that perspective, but I think what I'm going to talk about can apply to anybody that's in any sort of training. But I will be talking about the types of I practice at an academic center, a large American academic center, and I teach almost probably every day. Probably every single day. These are the types of trainees that I interact with: medical students, residents, fellows, and when I say medical students, the type of medical students I teach are medical students from every different background, but it's usually in the anesthesia setting. They're coming to do an anesthesia rotation, or I teach anesthesia residents, or I teach critical care fellows, which are a fellow is just they have more training. A fellow is extra optional training you get after residency, and the types of fellows that I'm usually training or working with are critical care in the ICU setting when I'm in the ICU. Additionally, I also almost every day I am with nurse anesthetist students, and often NPs and PAs that are in training as well in the ICU. So there's a lot of different trainees that I'm around, and then also new nurses, but I guess those aren't necessarily trainees. I guess my point is, if you're in an academic center, or even if you're not, there's a lot of people that are training around you. And I think it's very important to know how to teach in a clinical setting. So today I'm not just talking about teaching like on a chalkboard, right, in a classroom. That's a whole other thing. But teaching on the job in a clinical setting, which is what I do basically every day. So I want to just talk about that and explore that, and how to really explore how everyone can get the most out of teaching, not just your trainee, but you yourself, when you go about teaching, and how to teach. I mean, I'm always a grain of salt, right? I am not an expert in teaching. I have no degrees in teaching. I don't know anything about teaching. What I do know about, teaching, I get from my wife, who is has been an educator for a long time, and is very skilled and a masterful educator. And I've picked up a lot of things from her. But anyway, so whatever. Let's just get into this. All right, so I think one of the first principles to talk about is how influential you are as a trainer, whatever it is that you're doing. Maybe you're a charge nurse, or maybe you're a very experienced nurse, or you're a nurse anesthetist listening to this, or you're something that I can't even think of. I want you to think about when you were training, and how incredibly influential the person that was training you, how they were, right? Sometimes the first interactions, the first day of how someone did something has stuck with you your entire career, right? You know what I'm talking about. Like the way someone said something, or the way they're like, oh yeah, this is how I've done it. And then there's something about being in that training mindset where you're learning, where anything, things that people teach at you just stick into your brain like glue. They're just tattooed on your brain, and they stay there forever. Right? you will keep doing those things the same way the rest of your career. Now, I think that's great, right? Being in this very impressionable mode, but there's also great danger and then great responsibility as someone who is involved in training, because if you are teaching things the wrong way, right? You are teaching those same habits to impressionable minds. And I think what's even more dangerous is you may be doing it, and you may be teaching things in a way that by your example, right? It's your example. It's the way you're actually doing things. It's not necessarily what you're saying. Like everything you're doing is being observed by trainees. Why is it being observed? Because they are trying to orient themselves. They're groping to understand this new world, particularly new trainees, right? The medical world is crazy foreign. It's crazy, right? It's like nothing like real life. And if you have very little experience in medicine, or if you've just been in a classroom for a year or 2 years or whatever, just learning textbook stuff, and then you're in a clinical setting, it's totally foreign. When I was a medical student, I was so out of it. I was so dumb. I didn't know, I just think back on all the stupid things I did. Not that I made big mistakes that endangered patients or stuff like that, but my understanding of medicine was so infantile at that time. When I look back, it's mind blowing. It's mind blowing. And so, what my point is, trainees are so impressionable because they're observing everything. Not that they're not spying or whatever, but they're groping for understanding. They're groping to be oriented, to feel grounded in this new world that they're in. So they're extremely, extremely observant of everything you're doing, right? It's true. Just think about when you were a trainee. You were in the exact same mindset. And so because of this, someone can pick up bad habits by example, not by direct, explicit instruction, right? People are very, very observant of how people behave, right? That's like part of human nature. We observe people. And then we internalize those things. And then the way that egregious acts, just outside of medicine, if you think of terrible regimes throughout history, like military regimes, whatever, the reason that all these things get condoned internally is because everybody else is, no one's speaking up, and people are just doing, things get normalized. Bad behavior and bad, ways of doing things, they get normalized, and then people stop noticing them until something really bad happens. So this can happen in medicine where people, they are observing whoever's training them. They're observing their, whatever the behavior is, whether it's being, I'm groping for examples, but whether it's being like, oh yeah, well, we're supposed to do it this way, but I just do it like this. And the way that they're doing it, is not the best way to do it. And so you're teaching that. For one thing, you're normalizing that, hey, you don't really need to do things by the book. You can do things this way. Now, there's exceptions to this, of course. So you're normalizing that behavior, and then you're training them with that behavior. And then once that person becomes experienced, now they're dogmatic about their bad behaviors, right? Meaning the way that they do things, they believe it's like enshrined, and that it's the right way because they've been doing it the way the whole time. And now to retrain or to get that behavior out of them can be nearly impossible because they're dogmatic about it. They're like, no, this is how you do it, right? This is the way we've been doing things. Well, that's not a reason to keep doing things. Just because a certain way is the way to keep doing things, it's not a reason to keep doing things that same way. So I think my whole point with this is you are being watched. If you're training someone, they're watching they're watching how you're talking to other people. They're watching how you take a break. They're watching how you interact with patients, and they're internalizing every drop of information they're getting from you. They truly, truly are. So it's a huge responsibility that you have as someone who's training people. All right, so I kind of want to talk about how to actually, hands-on training. So again, I oversee lots of different procedures and lots of different types of people, right? I oversee med students doing intubations or putting in IVs, or residents putting in an epidural or a spinal, or also, breathing tubes. So I observe a lot of these things. Many, many different procedures, many ways of doing things. I observe, I instruct. My approach, now I'm not saying this is the right approach, but I very much believe in when you meet a trainee for the first time, you understand what their background is and where they're at, and then orient them, help ground them, and then I really believe in autonomy. I think autonomy, structured and safe autonomy, is extremely important for people to grow and learn to do things in their own way. It's so important. I think it's fundamental to becoming an effective clinician as you're training, to give people autonomy that they need to grow. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. One of the first principles for me, I'm just making up this stuff on the spot. I'll call this principle number one. To give trainees autonomy is you have to give them space to struggle. They got to struggle. That is how you learn. So when someone's doing what I mean is constant point by point, turn by turn instruction is not good. To be like, okay, say like you're, training someone to intubate, and so here, let me run you through what I do. So let's say I have a medical student who's never intubated before, and first I get oriented about where they're at. I'm like, okay, have you ever intubated someone before? And they're like, oh yeah, maybe 2 or 3 times. Like, okay, great. And then I will go over the very very briefly, not complicated, not a big lecture, 3 minutes. I will go over the basic principles of intubating. Right? If you are an expert in your field, you should be able to explain maybe complex procedures. Not that intubating is that complex, but you should be able to explain things in very simple and easy understandable terms. Things should not be complex. They shouldn't be opaque. There shouldn't be like a firewall of experience and understanding. You should be able to condense things down in very simple forms into people that don't even know anything about medicine. You should be able to explain things like that. So I give them a very brief overview, like, hey, here's how I do things. There's many ways of doing things. Here's how I kind of do an intubation. Walk through the steps beforehand, and then I'm like, okay, have at it, right? And I'll have them intubate, and now I'm observing them and watching them, and they obviously are not going to do very well because if it's the first couple times intubating, it's hard for them. By the way, med students. If you're a patient somewhere in an academic center, it's possible you could have a med student who's inexperienced putting a breathing tube in your trachea. That's a reality. It's something you sign up for when you come to an academic center. So that's just the thing that can happen. Now, I mean, it's safe, right? We're observing, and they're the whole time. Anyway, so my point is, as I watch them, I don't give them point by point instructions. I mean, I do sometimes, maybe a little nudge here or there, but I stand back and I'm silent. And I let them struggle for a little bit safely in a very safe way, and I intervene when I feel like it's not when it's becoming unsafe. Because you cannot learn by someone just standing over your shoulder telling you point by point what to do. That is not how someone's going to learn. Now, there's many different types of training situations. Let's go to another situation. Let's say I have a medical student who's going to be intubated, but now I have a senior resident, anesthesia resident. That's overseeing the whole case, and they're acting as an attending. I let that person have so much autonomy. Here's what I do. You want to know what I do when I'm starting a case? So let's say I have a med student that's going to intubate and maybe put in an IV, and I have a senior resident who's, they're 4 years into the residency, and they know what they're doing by that point. I sit in a chair and I keep my mouth shut, and I observe. I talk to everybody about the plan and all that. We get everything grounded, again, grounding, orienting. And then I sit in a chair and I keep my mouth shut. And I let that senior resident run the show. Because I want them to have that experience of, being an attending anesthesiologist and running the show. And I think this is what I mean by autonomy. And you give trainees autonomy within their sphere of training, and it must be in a safe way, obviously, and they have to be constantly observed, and you must step in when you feel like things are getting unsafe. I think autonomy is just an extremely important principle in teaching people correctly, because once they struggle and they go through this and that, and then you debrief about it, and then you give them pointers about this and that and this, and they will remember that stuff. Wow, did they remember that stuff? So same things with, let's move to when I'm in the ICU and I have a fellow, a critical care fellow, right? So this is someone who's already done residency, and I work with a couple different types of fellows. So they're experienced. They're a doctor. They now have a few years of experience under their belt, and they know what they're doing. One of the first things I say when I'm on the unit for a week stretch or whatever, I look at them and I say, you are running the code blues. It's one of the first things I say to critical care fellows. You are running it. I'm not running it. You're running it. I make sure that they know that up front so they're prepared, so that when someone goes into cardiac arrest, I want them to run it. Anyway, it's been a few days since I've recorded whatever that was, so I might repeat myself a little bit here. But I think one of the main points that I'm trying to make is you have to create enough space for people to grow and to feel creative and to have autonomy. Like, people have to have that sense of creation and autonomy to be able to grow, to step into their role. And you must create that space for them. If you're constantly looking over the shoulder, or if they're feeling that way, right? It all depends on how they're feeling. You may not be thinking you're doing that. It depends on how they're feeling. You just keep them in a box, that they're never able to grow from, to be able to become fully trained and very efficient and reliable and experts in what they do as well. And I find if you foster that type of environment, learners they're thrilled, meaning they're very happy to explore their abilities. People, as they're learning things, like you know what I'm talking about. When you're learning something new, and once you feel uncertain about it first, and then you become more bold, and you want to experiment with how well you're doing, and it's a thrilling thing to become better and better and better at something, to getting to the point where you're masterful over it. That is a very thrilling process. And so when you give learners the environment for them to do that, they thrive and they love it and they enjoy it. They want to be there, right? They're not just having a miserable experience with someone that's above them, just top down talking at them all the time, right? We all know what that feels like. And we hate it. Everybody hates that. Everybody hates the feeling of being micromanaged. We all hate it. We all know when it's happening, and we absolutely hate it. So stepping away from that micromanaging role, and again, you may be doing it. It's possible you might be doing it without even realizing it. If I feel like if I'm in a teaching environment, and I notice that I've been rambling for a little bit. I'm like, oh, you know what? I need to shut up. I'm talking too much. I don't want to talk all day. With my residents or my medical students, I want to make sure that they're doing things with their hands, and that I'm out of the environment for a little bit, so that they can have that sense of autonomy and that room to grow. Let's talk about making mistakes when learners, when they make mistakes, right? There's different types of mistakes, right? So we all make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes at any time, at any point in your career, whatever your career is. When you're a learner, there's different types of mistakes, right? There's, there's just mistakes of inexperience. And I don't know if you should call that a mistake. Just not doing something well because you're just not very good at it yet, right? You just don't have the experience doing it. Like, a classic one is like teaching someone how to intubate, how to put in a breathing tube, how to bag, mask, ventilate, right? Someone who's just barely doing that, they've only done it a couple times. They're not going to be very good at it. So I don't know if that's a mistake, but obviously they're having a deficient skill or whatever. I'm not even finding the right word for it. It's all very expected, and there's nothing wrong with it. I find that learners are like they perseverate on what they could have done more and stuff, and I'm always like, it's okay. These things will come. You can always reflect on what you've done better, but these things take repetition. So there's simply some kind of mistakes that will naturally iron out with repetition. And there's not much to do to address, though. You don't need to address stuff like that, except give correct instruction timely when it's needed, and then just encourage them. Just keep encouraging them as they grow along, and those things will just iron out. Now, then there's genuine mistakes of like omission, right? There could be mistakes of ignorance because they didn't know a thing. Maybe there was a deficiency in their training, where they were what they learned in a textbook. They didn't quite learn that thing, or they weren't trained properly on that thing. So there's like a mistake of ignorance, which can be a mistake of omission, right? And these types of mistakes need prompt intervention and instruction promptly. You correct them on the spot. Those types of mistakes. I think there's other types of mistakes that maybe should not be necessarily. You got to be careful about correction. When I mean correction, it's always gentle, right? It's always a gentle correction. It's always, tone matters so much. Your tone is so important. Just patience and just having a gentle tone. But I think timely correction, be like, oh no, yeah, you do it this way. That's not the, just being very direct, and gentle, I think is very important. So yeah, those kind of mistakes of ignorance or mistakes of omission should just be corrected on the spot. It's just in the moment, correction. So, now there can be, repetitive mistakes or deficiencies that are a pattern that you're starting to see with someone that you've worked with for a while. That kind of correction needs to not be public, in my opinion. That shouldn't happen in front of a care team in the operating room or in the ICU. There are many conversations that need to happen just between the two of you, because you don't want to embarrass the person that's learning that can stifle their growth and their right. That can be devastating. That can be devastating. Stuff like that can sometimes make people drop out. Seriously, I mean, you don't know how sensitive people can be to correction and stuff like that, and just even simple things that you think are innocent, providing that correction in front of people, in front of staff, that could be devastating to someone. So much so that they could leave the field, they could drop out. It's happened. I mean, it happens. Maybe just that one thing that you just said a little too sarcastically, maybe that was the thing that broke the whatever back, and that was it for them, right? That could happen. So I think you need to be careful. So things need to happen, some sort of corrections need to happen between the two of you in private. And I always like to say, I heard lather before you shave, right? So when you're going to give correction, you lather them up with praise, genuine praise, right? Not BS, genuine praise. Like, hey, I love how you do this and this and this. And then I've noticed this and this and this. What do you think about that? I think, being open-ended, asking them questions to try to explore how they're feeling and see where they're at the same page. Because they might be thinking the same thing you're thinking, like, oh man, this thing I'm just not doing well. They may be thinking the same thing. And then it becomes a lot more easy and more approachable to address with them. So I think open-ended questions, and then, privately when it needs to happen is best. Now, there can be obviously the bad, worst kind of mistake, which are like mistakes of negligence and mistakes of like willful negligence, right? And that I think those mistakes probably need to be, well, okay, let me back it up. There's mistakes made because of poor judgment, and it's possible that sometimes some people exhibit poor judgment, and that they can demonstrate a pattern of poor judgment over and over again, like egregiously bad decision making. And if that is something that you're observing in a learner, it's probably something that needs to be taken to whoever's in charge of whatever program it is, and it needs to be explored from there, right? And then whoever's in charge of whatever the program is can then reach out to other people to see if they've seen a pattern, right? And these are like really bad lapses of judgment. And I think it's sometimes possible, it's rare, but I think it's possible where some people in healthcare particularly, and I'm not just talking about med students, but nurses, et cetera, respiratory therapists, whatever. I'm not thinking of anybody in particular, by the way, where some people, they get into a program and they're in training and they exhibit chronically poor judgment, and they may not be fit for the field. And I know that sounds harsh to say, and it is harsh to say, but it's also realistic, because particularly in medicine, where mistakes can kill people and cost people's lives, there are some people that, for whatever reason, the judgment that they're exhibiting, that it's just not sound. Not chronically, but but there's a pattern, maybe chronically, there could be a pattern. I'm not saying these people are dumb or anything like that. I don't mean to say that, but sometimes it just doesn't fit for whatever reason it is. And it may not be the field for them. And if this pattern is suspected, it should be addressed early. Not only for patient safety, but for that individual, because if they're not going to make it far in the field, that they should find out about this early on, and they should receive that feedback. They should also be given a chance, if reasonable, for remediation, right? But anyway, so there's kind of like mistakes of poor judgment, and then there's, getting back to the mistakes of just willful negligence, and that's a huge problem, right? If people are being willfully negligent, if people are lying, right, and they're lying to cover their mistakes, that's a big problem. One thing I tell interns and medical students, one thing I tell them is, for me, you can't make a mistake. The only mistake you can make is not asking a question when you should have, not coming for help when you should have. That's because everything else is just a mistake of inexperience. But when they do something, if an intern, particularly interns, right? Because interns are doctors that have graduated from medical school, and they can write orders, right? They have power within a hospital system. A medical student doesn't have that much power, doesn't have prescription powers to write orders. An intern does. So interns they have the ability to cause harm from their ignorance or negligence, right? So one thing I particularly tell interns, like the only mistake you can make in my book is if you don't come and ask me for help when you feel like you should have needed it. And then you just went ahead with something without being sure about it, and it resulted in something bad. That's a problem, and that's something within their control, right? And as someone who is teaching, if you're listening to this, you should foster that environment of being accessible. That is so important. They have to feel that you're accessible, so they're not afraid to come to you. I mention all the time, like a surgeon who runs an operating room like a tyrant, where everyone's afraid to speak up. That's going to result in patient harm because the surgeon can't know everything that's going on in the operating room, and people are scared to speak up. And then something goes on, it gets neglected, and then suddenly there's patient harm, and that is a lot of the responsibilities on that surgeon's fault in this example. So as someone who's teaching, you need to foster that environment of being accessible, not being annoyed, not being sarcastic, but being open and patient and willing to teach. And people pick up on that real fast, what kind of, teacher you are, I think. I think another really important thing with teaching is to offer feedback, timely feedback. Right after, say you spend a day with your nursing student or your medical student, at the end of that day or with that session, you should offer them feedback. Now, I need to work on this too. I don't always do it. And the necessities of clinical practice sometimes get in the way, like patient care. Sometimes you just don't have time. And I need to work on all these things I'm talking about here. I don't do these things perfect either, right? But people want feedback, and feedback about things that they've done well and things that they can work on. And everybody does things well, and everybody does things that they work on. And if you think hard enough, sometimes that's kind of the challenge. Like, they're doing great. Well, they're doing great, but you should give them the respect of coming up with something that they can do even better, and be very specific. And I think giving real-time feedback is also great. Like, wow, that was awesome how you did that. These little things that are so easy for you to drop just buoy people up, right? They mean everything to someone who's in a learning environment that is doing something new, and it builds their confidence. It builds them up, and they feel awesome. They feel awesome that they're doing it, and everybody has a good day together. But I think giving timely feedback at the end of the day, right away, is great, and just be direct. You don't need to be all awkward about it. Like, hey, I think you did this good. I love how you did this. I love this. I love this. I think you could work on this and this. And sometimes, you truly work with outstanding people, and you can't I don't think they can do anything better. But of course they can, right? Yes, they can. And sometimes you just come up with something generic, right? And that's fine. Sometimes you just work with phenomenal people. I work with phenomenal people. All of them are amazing. Med students, residents. I work at just a fantastic place with just incredible people. But yeah, I think timely feedback and then written feedback, if wherever you work, if they have that, getting that done right away. And I just think teaching is so fun, right? In another life, I'm like a high school teacher. I'm like teaching physics at a high school somewhere, because I think teaching is so amazing and so fun. It's so thrilling. It's such an awesome thing, and I'm really grateful that it's also a part of my job as well. And I take it serious, and I can always do better. I know there's more that I can do, but anyway, there's probably more I've talked about, but I think I'll leave that topic at that. All right, let's get to a book today. I read this book a while ago, but I don't think I've talked about it on the podcast. It's called Invisible Women: Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. This is by Carolyn Criado Pérez. This book is like a fire hose amount of data and research, giving a really definitive and sweeping conclusion. Half the population of the world doesn't really exist in data. I've never read a more thorough and convincing book about the gender data gap that exists in every possible arena you can think of. I came away from this book like horrified, and just mostly horrified. As I ended this book, I was horrified. This book will lift the veil from your eyes about the numerous ways in which women have been discriminated against in every conceivable way. The author does a really good job explaining that man is basically the default human. When trying to focus on women involvement in anything like movies or video games,
it's seen as niche. Like to be a woman is seen as niche from that standpoint. Like making a movie with a female protagonist, superhero protagonist, is seen as niche. How can half the human population be niche? Right? It's absurd. Where feminism and being a woman is seen as an identity, being a white man is the silent default, condemning, quote, identity politics, while subsuming the dominant default identity that hides in plain sight, being a white man. While the author goes deep into data, her constant theme is always present. There is a data gap for women in almost every field that renders them functionally invisible. Somehow, Americans imagine the working class as being a white man, when it is indeed impoverished women who make up a huge chunk of the working class. One of my favorite quotes from this book is the phrase, and I'll remember this quote for the rest of my life. Quote, working women is a tautology, or like a redundancy. There is no such thing as a woman who doesn't work, only women who are unpaid for their work. Many examples abound. Cities and highways are designed for the basic commuter into work and back out, a male-dominantly driving route. Women typically use public transportation and do more like training, where they ping-pong from place to place on their way home. City infrastructure does less to support such commuters and even less to create a safe traveling environment to them when they experience sexual assault or other acts of sexual menace. Bathroom design is, quote, gender neutral when they are designed with equal floor spacing. However, women have fundamentally different physiology, anatomy, and biology. Not only can they not stand to urinate, but they also menstruate and they get UTIs more often, needing more space and more time in bathrooms. This is tremendously important, particularly in developing countries where women may not use public restrooms at all for safety reasons, and they relieve themselves at night because it is less socially acceptable for women to do it in the open as it is for a man to do it. And that puts them at risk for sexual assault. This also opens women up to getting diseases such as pelvic inflammatory disease or other infectious diseases. I've only covered seriously 3 pages of this book. There's so much data. There's so much more to talk about. She asserts that women are afraid of open public spaces. This impacts mobility and access to cities. They adjust travel patterns to avoid sexual assault. When some data shows that men are victims of crime at equal amounts to women, and that women need to stop being so, quote, hysterical, this is a classic data gap problem. Women are not reporting every single act of sexual assault that is happening. Sexual assault is mostly invisible in the data. Around 85% of women don't have maternity leave in the U.S. Trying to claim childcare as a work expense would be laughable in the default male world. We live in a world where a man can go rent a hotel and order a drink at a bar before a work conference and get this all paid for. But a woman cannot ask to cover childcare so that she can attend that same conference. Right? It would be laughable to be like, hey, can I get this covered by work for childcare? Tenure is harder for women because they have limited time to achieve it during childbearing ages. Men who take paternity leave are much more likely to be involved in a child's life, yet this is rarely offered to help offset childcare for women. And let's make something very clear. The economy could not operate without the unpaid work that women do. Is it included in the GDP of countries? Of course not, despite the fact that unpaid work of women could account for $3.2 trillion of U.S. GDP. If women do work and file taxes, if they file their tax returns jointly with their husband or partner, they're likely to be taxed more because the lesser salary, which is typically a woman's salary, is stacked atop the higher salary and gets taxed more. Before the 1970s, the New York Philharmonic had 0 women. 10 years later, it was almost 50% women. How did they achieve such remarkable progress? Blind auditions. Computer work used to be relegated to clerical women work. Women built the first computer, but as soon as it was clear that it would have a major impact in business and economy, men took over. Women's health is constantly impacted by the gender gap. Endocrine disrupting compounds can cause cancer and may be involved in vast occupational exposure in traditional jobs that women do. Cosmetologists, nail salons, none of these are regulated in a safe way to protect women. Female nurses have more workplace violence than police officers. You'll never hear that on the news, right? Clothing, uniforms, PPE are all made for default man or a smaller version of a man without taking into account breasts, smaller gait, smaller hands, more fat density, less muscle mass, and on and on and on. Seatbelts, iPhones, wearable tech is one size fits man, and it's hurting women in many ways. Voice recognition is better at recognizing a man's voice. When Apple introduced their like wearable watches, their health, like iWatch, they didn't even think to include a menstrual calendar in the original version. Probably wasn't a woman involved in that decision. There are major and innumerable data gaps in healthcare. Breast pumps are dominated by a monopolized market. Black women are 243% more likely to die from childbirth than a white woman. I could go on and on. The truth of this book is infuriating. The problem is so vast, it's like paralyzing to think about. It's hard to know where even to begin. But this book is a phenomenal piece of work. Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men by Pérez. I highly recommend it. All right, let's get to questions from email, people that listen to the podcast. This is from Brian, last name withheld. My question is regarding the Bills-Bengal game injury. The news states that he is in critical condition. My understanding, they got his heart back in rhythm, but why would ICU doctors keep him sedated? I know he is intubated. Is that why? Also, what conditions after heart resuscitation is Hamlin possibly going through? Okay, so this happened right at the beginning of January. So I'm a little late answering this question, but it's very interesting to think about. So, and I'm not super knowledgeable about. I mean, I've read a couple like news articles about him and what happened, and I watched the footage where he gets hit in the chest, and then he gets up, and then like 2 seconds later he collapses. They did chest compressions, and he was intubated on the scene, I believe. So my first thought when I saw that is like, well, the blunt trauma just induced an arrhythmia, like maybe it was just timed at the wrong time in his cardiac cycle, and he went into VFib or VTAC, and then lost his pressure, and he arrested. So that was my first thought. My second thought is that he had an undiagnosed risk factor for sudden cardiac death. And one thing that's really important to think about was sudden cardiac death. So that's not just a phrase; it's a it's a thing. It's a diagnosis. I think a lot of people don't realize that sudden cardiac death is a diagnosis. It's not just like how did he die? Oh, he suddenly died of cardiac death. Like it's an actual diagnosis, and it's a category, and there's basically like two branches of it. You can die of sudden cardiac death, right? And young athletes are at high risk to die of sudden cardiac death, higher risk than the average population. It's not like a super prevalent disease, but it's usually a structural problem with the heart, like the actual heart muscle. There's something wrong with it. And what the classic one is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, sometimes abbreviated as HCOM, or sometimes people call it HOCM, where you just have too much muscle in your left ventricular outflow tract from your LV going out, and that can get in the way, and it can stop blood flow, and you can have sudden cardiac arrest, particularly being tachycardic or having low blood pressure. And athletes exert themselves and are tachycardic. So if you have that underlying undiagnosed, someone can certainly drop dead of that. There's also something called SAM, the systolic anterior motion of the mitral valve. This is all related to LVOT obstruction, left ventricular outflow obstruction. There's a surgical remedy for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which it's usually involves a sternotomy with a cardiac surgeon who carves out part of your inside of your left ventricle, so you have a better flow. So that was one of my thoughts. And then the other part of sudden cardiac death is usually, so there's a structural problem or an electrical conduction problem where you have like long QT syndrome or Brugada syndrome. And you can also have, myocarditis as a reason of sudden cardiac death. Anyway, the point is delay and cardiac arrest because of that. So those things can cause sudden cardiac death in athletes. So those are all my thoughts. Now, I have no idea if the NFL screens for these things, like if everyone gets an echocardiogram. I don't know. So I don't know what the likelihood of those things are. I have no idea. But this guy got admitted, and he was intubated probably because it was a code, and he probably had a little bit of lung problems because maybe he had some ribs that were cracked. Maybe he had an aspiration pneumonia or pneumonitis or something. Anyway, but I think he's doing fine. I believe he's discharged. But they figured it out, right? He probably needs a Holter monitor to monitor his rhythm out, and he probably had an echo and some other stuff. So I'm sure that they probably figured out what it was. And I have no idea about his if he does have a HOCM, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, he certainly cannot play until that can be resolved. Now, if he has a Holter monitor and everything's negative, then maybe it was just a one-off, blunt trauma causing an arrhythmia. Anyway, they'll figure it out. I posted some videos about this, and of course, the anti-vax crowd took off with it, and I just think it's it's just so tragic. I mean, how the unbelievable misinformation that's going on with athletes and sudden cardiac death. There's not an increased incident of it after the vaccines. There's some terrible data out there that it's like someone putting a bunch of headlines. People are like, oh, the headlines. How do we ignore these headlines? And it's just the average person lacks a fundamental understanding of how statistics works, how base rate works, and they just don't get it. And they think they do, and they get very upset, and they have conspiratorial thinking, and it's very sad. There's no evidence that there's increased incident of sudden cardiac death amongst athletes after the rollout of the mRNA vaccines. I'm probably preaching to the choir. If you're listening to my podcast, you're likely not an anti-vax person. Anyway, it's just terrible fallout from all this. Okay, that'll wrap it up for today. Email me at icudoctorecmo@gmail.com. I'm on TikTok. ICUDoc is my handle. And then Instagram, ICUDoctor TikTok. And I'll see you sometime next time I get around to recording. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.